Greetings, fellow detectives. Wizard Kitten here, bringing you a new Nancy Drew analysis video. For today's video, I want to discuss one of my favorite topics when it comes to the Nancy Drew series, the soundtracks. I think it's incredible how strong our visceral reactions can be when we hear the soundtracks of some of our favorite video games. The second that I hear a Nancy Drew soundtrack from one of my favorite games, it's like my brain explodes with nostalgia. Music plays such an important role in setting the scene of a game, guiding the plot, and connecting our emotions to what is happening in-game. I would argue that a huge chunk of our emotional connections to the Nancy Drew games comes from the music, which is perhaps why it is all the more disappointing and noticeable when a Nancy Drew soundtrack actually doesn't deliver. Now, thankfully, this is incredibly rare. And in fact, at least in my opinion, it doesn't happen until late into the series. Before I discuss the 3 games that I believe had soundtracks that simply did not work, let's look into some context. If you go to the Her Interactive website to purchase the soundtracks, you'll notice that the credited artist for all of the games, from Secrets Can Kill up to Alibi in Ashes, is Kevin Manthei. Now, I didn't know this until I started researching for this video, but Manthei is a fellow Minnesotan, don't you know? I was super pumped to discover this fun little bit of trivia, but ultimately, it's beside the point. Manthei composes for film, television, and video games, and brought to life some of my favorite songs of all time. The soundtracks for Tomb of the Lost Queen through Sea of Darkness were written by Thomas Regan, who brought the signature song trend to the games. The soundtrack for Midnight in Salem is credited primarily to Ryan Ricks, but also to a bunch of other artists as well, which is kind of the story for Midnight in Salem in general. A cobbled together outsourced mess, but we all know how I feel about that. And if you don't, check out the card in the upper corner. My point here is that the vast majority of the Nancy Drew games were composed by only 2 different composers during 2 different time periods. This allowed for a great deal of continuity and for the composers to have a really solid understanding of the goal of the Nancy Drew games and how the music could be integral to enhancing the mystery. I believe that this consistency is at least partially what made the soundtracks so successful. But where were they not successful? After all, that's what this video is about. Let's start first with the 20th mystery in the Nancy Drew series, Ransom of the 7 Ships. Now, out of context, I think this music is objectively solid. We get a lot of tracks that are perfect for a tropical island, tracks that are perfect for an adventurous afternoon out sailing, and a handful of tracks with Spanish influence that tie us into the storyline of El Toro. What we do not get, however, is any sense of danger, fear, apprehension, terror, intrigue, or loss when we need to get it. This mystery is about a kidnapping of Nancy's best friend, but you wouldn't know it by listening to the soundtrack. There are a total of 10 different tracks for Ransom of the 7 Ships, and 6 of them, over half, sound like this. The tracks Wander, Sailing, Monkeys, Johnny, Island, and Discovery are all very high energy, with primarily bouncy and joyful tones. We additionally have 2 songs, High Tension and Danger, that are high energy but are supposed to be intense. The intention of these tracks is to play during moments of immediate danger or confrontation. Think falling off a cliff while rock climbing, or being trapped in a cave and running out of air. There are, however, 2 issues with this. First, those moments are not when these songs play. Instead, when Nancy is trapped in a cave and running out of air, and George is trying to solve a puzzle to save her, one of the only actual dangerous moments of this game, we hear this. It seems very silly, but go check out my 2020 live stream of Ransom of the 7 Ships for proof, linked in the card above. The second issue with this is that high energy does not always equal high intensity. And in fact, low energy intensity is often more effective, particularly for a mystery where we should feel intensity the entire time. There should, in fact, be a baseline of feeling unsettled and concerned. Nancy should be worried about Bess for the entirety of this mystery, but she's not, and neither is the music. If we think back to the final scene, the only other kidnapping mystery in the series, the music accompanied Nancy's panic and constant stress. The tracks were unsettling, dark, and mysterious. They made us always feel a little bit on edge. Meanwhile, the tracks in Ransom of the 7 Ships either feel like I'm chilling on a beach sipping an ice cold beverage or running from rabid monkeys. There is no intrigue, there is no mystery, there is no care for the fact that Bess is missing. To be fair, Ransom of the 7 Ships does have 2 lower energy tracks that could conceivably be labeled as intense. One of these is Underwater. It's a lovely track, but just like the name suggests, it only plays when Nancy is underwater and scuba diving. This does nothing to add to the actual mystery at hand, because as far as we know, Bess isn't chilling at the bottom of the ocean snacking on sushi. The heavy implication is that she is alive and hidden somewhere on the island. The other lower energy intense track that we get is called Toro. This track is actually what I wish the rest of the soundtrack sounded like. But since it's only 1 of 10, well, you get my point. So, Ransom of the 7 Ships ultimately does not have a successful soundtrack because the tone is just all wrong. This is something that the mystery struggled with in general, because bright, sunny, tropical paradise does not equal dark, mysterious kidnapping of Nancy's best friend, at least not in the way that her interactive did it. The dissonance between what Nancy should have been expressing and what she ultimately does end up expressing, as illustrated by the music, is just too great. And so we have our first unsuccessful soundtrack. The second soundtrack that I consider to be a flop belongs to none other than the Shattered Medallion. Are any of you surprised? Fellow detectives know that I have a lot of issues with this game, and the soundtrack ends up being one of them. The biggest issue with the Shattered Medallion soundtrack is that the songs simply are not memorable, creative, indicative of any sort of personality, or even indicative of the location of the game. Let's start with that problem first. This game takes place in New Zealand, objectively one of the coolest, most adventurous places on Earth, with a rich history and culture all its own. Usually, when Nancy travels to a location outside of the US, the soundtrack specifically utilizes instruments and techniques particular to that location and culture. When she goes to Germany, we hear accordions. When she goes to Ireland, we hear flutes and fiddles and the bodhran? Irish words are hard to pronounce, my apologies. When she goes to Japan, we hear the koto. But when we go to New Zealand, do we hear the unique sounds of New Zealand, utilizing some of the instruments created by the Maori people? Nope. Instead, we basically get a bunch of variations like this. Based on my research into traditional Maori instruments, a good chunk of the most iconic ones are more horn or flute-like, especially more muted horns and flutes, which is clearly not the major inspiration for most of the Shattered Medallion soundtrack. I'll link some videos I watched while researching for this video in the description, so that you can hear these beautiful instruments for yourself. Instead of these beautiful instruments, however, we get a lot of huge, aggressive orchestral moments, hyped up game show moments with blaring trumpets, or some synthy techno kind of moments. I'm not saying that Maori influence was completely absent, but brief, drowned out percussion instruments is not enough. The soundtrack needed to do better in conveying location. And even if we pretend like we don't care about conveying the location through the music, which we do, the songs themselves are not at all memorable. There are 4 songs that play throughout the game purely as part of the game show. Adventure, opening and closing music, which why are those even tracks on their own? Come on. And Pacific Run. All of these tracks sound the same and are basically lazy reiterations of one another. And they unfortunately are a huge chunk of what we hear during the game. Other songs on the soundtrack are also similarly repetitive and weirdly very quiet. It's almost like they didn't want us to hear the music in the background at all, unless it was the blaring trumpets mentioned earlier. We therefore, at best, end up with a handful of tracks that sound fine out of context, but do nothing to establish actual context or meaning. When I hear forest, even out of context, I know immediately that I'm wandering through a Pennsylvanian forest at nighttime, desperately hoping that I don't run into some ghost dogs. I can do that immediately because that track is memorable and specifically related to a context in the game in order to set the scene. When I hear Renaissance on my Nancy Drew playlist, I'm immediately transported to the halls of Blackmore Manor, wandering around in search for clues related to the Penvillin family. When I hear adventure or exploration from the Shattered Medallion, I certainly can't say with any certainty that I'm in New Zealand. And even if I could, I couldn't tell you where in the game I'm placed. It just didn't come together well. And so we have our second unsuccessful soundtrack. Finally, the last unsuccessful soundtrack in the series, you guessed it, Midnight in Salem. While this game went wrong basically everywhere, it also managed to botch one of the most consistently brilliant parts of the Nancy Drew series, in that its soundtrack has absolutely no personality whatsoever. My first issue with this soundtrack is that a sense of place is only peripherally established. Even in other domestic Nancy Drew mysteries, where Nancy travels to a U.S. state without necessarily iconic music, a location is still clearly established. Trail of the Twister, which takes place in Oklahoma, brings us a distinct bluegrass feel. The Deadly Device, which takes place in a science and technology lab in Colorado, brings us an undeniably techno-futuristic science-focused sound. Secret of Shadow Ranch, which takes place in the deserts of Arizona, brings us a country-style soundtrack infused with electric guitar and an air of intrigue the farther away Nancy gets from the ranch. Midnight in Salem, in contrast, brings us lo-fi beats, which are painfully repetitive. I can only generously say that a handful of the tracks give me ghosty vibes, but in no way do they match the ghosty vibes of previous games, like Shadow at the Water's Edge, Ghost of Thornton Hall, Haunting of Castle Malloy, or Ghost Dogs of Moon Lake. So, not only do the songs do very little to convey atmosphere as part of the location, they also do nothing to establish the sounds of Salem, Massachusetts itself. Again, it is clear that even a state without a distinct sound can be expertly conveyed through music. In my mind, at least, the soundtrack would have been a lot more effective if there was almost a colonial style to a portion of the music, to give us a sense of the historical depth of Salem. Use instruments that would have been available during the time of the Salem witch trials, for example. Or design the music to sound historical. This is vague, but you know what I mean. Think successful soundtracks that bring forth a sense of time lost, like The Final Scene or Last Train to Blue Moon Canyon. And again, if we didn't care about a soundtrack being able to establish a sense of place or atmosphere, which we very much do, the songs in this soundtrack are still not good, starting with the fact that they all sound practically the same. This soundtrack brings us one memorable song in the form of the apparently edgy, cool song that Nancy uses to finally get May to talk to her. This song plays for far too long and at multiple times and places, which is something that all of the other songs frankly do as well, to the point that you no longer even realize that you are hearing them. They lose any power that they could have had by becoming terribly mundane because not only are they redundant within themselves, but they also play on repeat within each location. I think a great example of this is the Pancake song. It's technically called Friendly, but I find it anything but. Take a quick listen. My ears can only take hearing the exact same strain for so long. Dun 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 dun. Oh, it's the worst. What all this repetition effectively does is make the song annoying, something that a soundtrack should never do. Furthermore, it makes the soundtrack almost ambient, another thing that a soundtrack should never do. We should not forget that the music is there. The music should not be there to simply fill in the silence. Soundtracks exist as a way to help establish the storytelling, the mood, the narrative arc, the characters, the depth, and the meaning of a work. This cannot happen when all of the songs sound the same. Use the same instruments, use the same beats, repeat within themselves, and have absolutely no character. And so we have our third unsuccessful Nancy Drew soundtrack. Now, as we wrap up this video, I would like to reiterate once again that the vast majority of the Nancy Drew soundtracks are near perfection. So much so that I'm not even positive that I could do a top 10 ranking because they are all so incredibly good. However, if that is a video that you would like to see, let me know in the comments down below, and I will certainly try. I truly believe that only 3 out of the 33 games were unsuccessful as far as the music goes, which, hey, pretty good odds. Ransom of the Seven Ships suffers primarily because of tonal mismatching, while the Shattered Medallion and Midnight in Salem made little to no effort to convey place, atmosphere, or personality through their music. While the songs may objectively be fine to listen to out of the context of a game, they do not do their jobs within the game. And since the other 30 Nancy Drew games did this so flawlessly, it's unfortunately very noticeable. But what do you think? Do you agree with me? Do you think that any of the other soundtracks were unsuccessful? Do you also think that these soundtracks were total bummers? Which soundtracks are your favorite, and what do you think makes a good soundtrack? Let me know down in the comment section. And as always, thank you so much for watching, fellow detectives. Please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more Nancy Drew and Sims 4 content. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you soon.